I want to get a chance to, like I said, we're going to have 2 counselors that are going to come up here today. If you guys have never gone through counseling, or maybe you've never thought about it, it maybe sounds like a weird idea, maybe it sounds like something that is not spiritual, or maybe it sounds like something that you should go to your Bible instead of go to counseling. I'm going to be very upfront about it. I believe in counseling, I believe in therapy, I believe in medicine, I believe in all of those things that help us grow closer. I also believe in the power of prayer. I believe in the power of bringing things out into the open, and sometimes just talking through things. So with that being said, I have invited Miss Cassandra and Miss Kayla, who are professional counselors here on staff at Praise Church, to be a part of this with us. So can I welcome up Miss Kayla and Miss Cassandra? Thank you, guys. So, for you guys that don't know, Miss Kayla has been on staff here for a year, and Miss Cassandra has been on staff here for the last 3 years. What is your technical title? I don't want to mess it up, so I'm going to let you say it.
I am an LPC, which means Licensed Professional Counselor, and I'm licensed by the state of Texas.
Awesome. And yours is special.
I am a licensed marriage and family therapist associate, which just means I'm still getting started. I've been doing counseling total for a little over 2 years, and so I'm working on getting my clinical hours. But as a marriage and family therapist, Cassandra and I do a lot of the same things, or we can help people in very similar ways, but my focus just tends to be more on the relationships, whether I'm working with a couple or their family unit. Even if I'm working with an individual, I'm still very mindful of what are the relationships going on in their life and other things that are impacting them.
So, technical terms, obviously, would be you guys get a chance to invite with families. I know you do a lot more families and you do a lot more marriage and you do a little bit of both. What would be the major difference in between you guys for somebody who's saying, hey, I want to maybe come see you guys, I want to sit down and have a conversation with you all. What would be, is there a difference inside of your counseling realm?
So there's a little bit of a difference. We're both trained in a lot of different things. We're both trained in working with anxiety, working with clinical mental health disorders, working with relationships, with careers, all sorts of things. You name it, we can work with it. Transitional issues in life. Her focus, as she said, is more from a relationship perspective, I guess you could say. And I work with relationships, but I do a lot more individual.
Okay. So I think we'll kind of just jump right into it because for me, I know there's a short amount of time and I kind of want to dive into that. But one of the things that I think that you said is we talk about relationships. Mm-hmm. So for a young adult who, majority of the people in this room, 18 to 25, who's going through a relationship and they just got broken up with, and one of the things that I hear them saying a lot is they say, I've got anxiety. And I've got anxiety about school, I've got anxiety about my relationship, I've got anxiety about my parents, and all these things coming together is making them just super anxious. Mm-hmm. If you could just, off the top, tell us what anxiety is, because I think sometimes we say anxiety is this, and there's maybe a different definition on social media, a different definition in the church, and there's a different definition of like the actual scientific term. Could you break it down for us?
Okay, so that's a great starting point. So anxiety is definitely one of those buzzwords we hear all the time. Everyone's talking about it, and it makes sense because they estimate about 40 million people every year in the United States alone suffer from some type of an anxiety disorder. And out of that 40 million, as you said earlier, 75% of those experience their first episode of anxiety by the time they're 25. So in your group especially, it's talked about a lot. But when it gets mentioned and people say, oh, I've got anxiety, I'm going through something, it becomes very confusing because it seems like everyone who's talking about it has a different experience or they have different symptoms. And so it becomes hard to think, okay, do I have anxiety? Is something wrong with me? When do I need to go see someone about it? And so just on a very basic level, anxiety is our natural response to a perceived threat. So everyone in this room, everyone who is alive experiences anxiety, which makes sense because you think about it, if you were to, I always like to use just really basic examples. If you were walking through the woods and you saw up ahead of you a big bear, you would want to react to that, right? You wouldn't want to stop and come up with, okay, plan A, plan B. You would just want to automatically go into that fight or flight mode and respond to that. Most of us aren't necessarily fighting bears all the time, but we do go through breakups and we struggle with things. And so our body responds to that to help protect us. So just to give a couple of examples, if you're driving down the road and someone pulls out in front of you, you're going to experience an anxiety response to protect yourself. If you're going through finals week at school and you're really nervous, what if I fail? What if I don't get to graduate on time? All these things, then that anxiety will kick in and it helps you to perform better, study more so that you can protect yourself from not doing well. So everyone experiences that. Now when it becomes a problem is when that anxiety response in your brain gets stuck in an on position. And so it becomes more of a chronic problem in your life. You can think about, it's kind of like experiencing something that someone else would not see as a problem, and yet you're overreacting to it. And I always think about snakes, so I have a phobia of snakes, terrified, pretty common. So if I were out in my backyard tomorrow and I saw a little snake coming by, it could be the size of a worm, and I'm automatically going to start screaming, my heart's going to be racing, I'm going to be jumping up and down as if it's like a big boa constrictor that's about to suck the life out of me. So my husband might come out and pick it up and say, "Are you serious? This is what you're screaming about? It's like the size of a worm." But in my mind, it was a real threat. So that's kind of what anxiety does to you. And within that clinical anxiety, there are many different forms it can take. Anywhere from generalized anxiety disorder, which is where just more often than not, you feel like there's some impending doom. And so you just kind of live in a constant state of anxiety. And then there's social anxieties. That's something I struggle with. And so that means whenever you're in a social situation, you're perceiving more of a threat than someone else might. Obsessive disorders, where maybe you're trying to protect yourself from germs or getting sick, and so you're washing your hands all the time or cleaning everything with bleach. PTSD, anytime if you've had a traumatic experience and something kind of activates those memories, then you can have an anxiety response. And so there are all different types of anxiety that we consider clinical, but the main difference between those things and what everyone else experiences is that the clinical anxiety begins to interfere with your life. And so it becomes more of an ongoing problem.
So for somebody who says they have anxiety, maybe that's just a feeling that you would say everybody probably has some sort of anxiety to everything, maybe not everything, but certain situations. To the person who has what we would say clinical anxiety, what does that feel like for somebody? Because I can tell you, probably a lot of people in here, they know somebody with anxiety, but they don't know what that feels like. And so for me personally, I did not know anything about anxiety. And I was in a relationship in college, and my girlfriend at the time, she had anxiety. And I thought she was actually crazy. I legitimately thought, you're just overwhelmed with life, and you're titling this as anxiety, and I can't relate to you, and you're honestly making my life difficult and hard, and now you're becoming a burden to me, and I don't even really want you in my life anymore. And I know that I'm not, obviously probably not the only person that has felt that way, but I could not put myself into the shoes of what anxiety felt like because I'd never gone through it. I don't know is there a way that you guys can describe to somebody this is what it feels like?
Well, I would say the first thing is that it's different for every person, and each person may experience a symptom similar that someone else does, but to a different level, to a different degree. Another way to kind of step outside of just saying these are anxiety symptoms, I also sometimes think when we're under stress. So maybe thinking about, okay, when someone is very stressed about something, maybe a lot of people here are in college, so you're really stressed about an upcoming exam or project. So what feeling is in your body. Maybe you feel very tense. You're like, oh my gosh, I got to get this done. Maybe your heart races. Maybe sometimes it's hard to breathe because you feel so overwhelmed by it. The physical symptoms that people experience and to anxiety, it comes from how we are perceiving that fear. And so the stress and anxiety that affects our body, it can affect our heart, our breathing, our muscle tension. And so a lot of times it's along those areas, or our stomach, our gut. Like maybe you feel nauseous, again, heart racing, hard to breathe, tension in our body. Some people experience headaches because of kind of the blood flow and things, how that's experiencing.
So would that be considered an anxiety attack?
The difference between experiencing physical symptoms of anxiety and an anxiety or panic attack, what some people want to label it, is the intensity and the time frame. So again, kind of going back to a normal situation, somebody's experiencing stress about this pending exam. I've got to study, I've been procrastinating, that's what always my thing was, procrastinating, putting it off, and now it's here and I got to do it. So kind of that ongoing sort of somewhat stabilized feeling of anxiousness. I got to get this done, I got to get this done, I'm really worried about the test. That's not an attack, that is anxiousness. If kind of Cassandra's point of the phobia, a person that would have a panic attack in relation to a phobia is that the moment she saw the snake is that immediately her heart would start racing, she would start having a hard time breathing, so it would increase intensely and then kind of hit that spike within a couple of minutes. And then hopefully it would decrease. So usually it's in a shorter amount of time and the symptoms increase, and then at some point they come down. It may not come back down to like ground zero, like they're perfectly fine, but the intensity does come down. So that's the difference between having symptoms versus an attack.
So obviously we're Christian. Why couldn't you just pray it away? Why can't you just suck it up? Why can't you just get over it? Why can't you just think about something different? Why can't you just pray more? Like when somebody says that to somebody who's in the middle of an anxiety attack or in the middle of a panic attack or even just anxious, is there any science that like is making them think that and they just can't get out of that brain or they can't get out of that, department in their head that they, like, why doesn't prayer help them with that? Or why can't they just think about something different? I know that's me and I think that way, but.
I think most people who really suffer from anxiety would say if we could do it, we would. We would just speak it and it would be gone. And it's just not that easy. We have automatic thoughts that happen in a split second. And so whenever we're triggered by a fear and that thought happens, our body automatically perceives a threat. And so that's our actual brain chemistry. It's called the amygdala. It's a little tiny spot in the back of our brain. And it goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode before we have time to think. So it's not so much that we're choosing to do this. I mean, it is an automatic quick response. And it's only through going through the process of learning how to take control of it once it starts to happen, that prayer can begin to work and learning all these other techniques that we can learn through counseling, reading books, all sorts of things. So those things are helpful, but the physical response is there from the beginning.
So are you born with anxiety or do you develop anxiety? Like, do you get to, when you're 18, do you just all of a sudden have anxiety, or does that happen when some big life experience happens?
All of the above. So physically, yes, we can be born. Essentially, the way in which we experience the physical symptoms are hormonal. So again, that immediate fight or flight response signals hormones in our body that goes to work, preparing our muscles to fight. That's the tension, preparing our lungs that we're breathing harder to get oxygen to our body to run. So it's a physical response from hormones and how our brain chemistry goes. So some people are born with their brain chemistry is different. You know, how their hormone levels are, how their brain is hardwired. Maybe, you know, they have an overproduction of that hormone. And we're all created differently, right? So sometimes it can be physical. Sometimes it can be developed over patterns of situations. Maybe, I don't want to get too much into it, but we get reinforced over experiences. But another thing to think about is also social learning, is that we can also learn our experiences, learn how to react based on our childhood, the people in our lives that we are around. So maybe, you know, we are around our parents or family members, relatives, siblings, where their responses to situations, we kind of observed this is a normal way of coping, and so it becomes normalized and sort of internalized. And so it can be any of those or a combination of those.
So, okay, we've talked about maybe how you're born with it and maybe the difference in it. At a certain point, like when it's just maybe it's too much, right? Like when you can maybe title it, or you've self-identified yourself as you're an anxious person, what do you do, like in that moment when you're in the middle of an anxiety attack and maybe nobody's around you, or maybe somebody are friends with you? Can we answer it in two parts? Maybe one answer. What does the person who's sitting in the room, who's around an anxious friend, do? And then on the other end, what does the anxious person do? Like, can they just breathe? Do they drink water? Do they just pray? Like, walk us through just a little bit of that.
So if you're going through, I guess you're talking about a panic attack. Okay. That can be a really scary situation, and it often takes people to the emergency room because they actually feel like they're having a heart attack. So this is not just if you know someone who's going through it and you're thinking kind of like you were saying, like, oh, come on, you know, there's not really a threat here. Just understand that this is a serious thing that they're going through at that moment. They're safe, they're not having a heart attack, but they do feel that. And the more they feel that, the more panicked they can become. So if you personally are going through that, it's important to kind of know that. Just whatever you know, I always have clients like come up with a coping card. Like, right now while you're calm, let's talk about 5 things that you can memorize and do if you find yourself in that situation. And so for some people, you know, one of the first things is to take deep breaths if you can, but that may be hard in a panic attack. Having a friend that you can call, listening to music, anything that you know works for you to calm you down is one of the best ways when you're in that situation to try to bring yourself back to a normal breathing rate and try to calm down. And until you do that, you really can't start thinking logically. That's another important thing to know about our brain chemistry. When the amygdala takes over and we have that emotional response, our prefrontal cortex that actually logically processes things shuts down. And so it's very hard to think logically in that moment. So just know, okay, I'm going to be okay, and try to do some of the calming things. And there's all sorts of different ones that we teach in therapy. There's grounding exercises. There's a lot that you can learn. You can look them up, Google them if that's something you struggle with.
Oh, take the second one. The only thing I would add is, yes, there are different techniques that work for everybody, so it's individualized. Right. So the second part of that, if you are the friend witnessing or hearing that your friend experiences these things, don't say, just calm down. Will not work. One thing, referencing one of the techniques is grounding exercises, and simply that's helping bring the person back down into reality, because the experience is taking over, the symptoms is taking over, the thoughts are taking over, as Cassandra explained. Simply being present, kind of staying in the moment with them. Maybe trying to continue to talk to them reassuringly, comfortingly, not, again, those cliche statements like just, you know, calm down, it's fine, it's no big deal, you know, but maybe something like, you know, it's going to be okay, like I'm here with you. Kind of that being a part of the experience with them. So I would say the biggest thing is just stay present. Don't make it about you. Don't make it, like, oh, this is too heavy. I can't deal with that. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that you can't sit there with them and have empathy, or at least sympathy, saying, I don't understand, but I'm going to stay present. And then, until they come down from the experience, and then, like Cassandra says, be present. It's like, okay, do you want to talk about it? What can I do to help you? What can I do to support you? And maybe now that you guys are hearing some of this information, you can share this and saying, hey, I don't know what this is like for you, but I've heard there are some resources out there. And so being able to share and encourage them to get help to deal with what they're dealing with, letting them know that they're not alone, and that there are, Christian resources and other things that they can do to deal with it.
So you guys are Christian counselors. What's the biggest difference between just the regular counselor that you might see at school, at a public school, versus you guys? Why Christian counseling? What's the biggest difference in that?
So school counselors are kind of a different thing. They do a lot of what we do, but they're really trained to do more of like community and work within the schools. And so often we get referrals from school counselors because they don't deal with the tough issues. So that's kind of a different thing. As far as Christian counselors, so usually when you think of a Christian counselor, they have typically gone through some kind of a certification training program that's basically made them like a trained pastoral counselor. So they have more knowledge about some of these things, but they don't actually have the full clinical experience and knowledge of a professional counselor in LMFT. But that does not mean that as a licensed counselor that my worldview is not as a Christian counselor. I carry that with me, whether I'm talking to a client about it or whether that's just my worldview and what I'm using to guide me. That's always there. I don't leave that at home, and that's one of the reasons why I work in a church, so that I can use that. So I definitely try to incorporate the biblical messages and truth into counseling.
I just want to echo that. I work in 2 locations. One is here with the church and in a secular place. And the biggest difference is the counselor's personhood as far as the experience for the client. So no matter what client I'm working with, I try to just meet them where they are. If they're Christian or have some kind of other faith or no faith at all, is, hearing where they are, and, if they are a Christian, then, hearing more about that and how can we incorporate that into the counseling process. My master's is from Liberty University. Go Flames.
Phantom. Woo, woo.
So I was trained more in that, specifically, okay, how do you take this secular idea, not take it and make it biblical, but how do you kind of maintain boundaries? How do you filter what maybe is being studied in the world and say, can I use this? Does it fit with my worldview? Does it filter through the Bible? And so that's my approach when I know that I'm working, in general, but especially when I know that I'm working with a person who is a Christian, making sure that I am approaching it effectively that way. In addition, there are plenty of ways to incorporate the Christian perspective, whether it's praying in session, scripture reading, scriptures that can be encouraging to address the issues we're working on. So there are those, practical ways too.
So when somebody were to say, like, man, if God, cared or loved, then, like, why am I so anxious? Like, there's cast all your anxieties onto me, like, be anxious about nothing. How do those coexist with the scientific side of things, but also the biblical side of, living and living this life that is naturally, everybody has anxieties.
Right. So that's always a really hard one with anything we're dealing with, when those questions of why can God allow this to happen? And that's one that's so hard to talk about or to understand, because we just can't understand. One of the books I think is on your resources that you'll get is How to Be, I can't remember the name of it now, but it has to do with using your anxiety as a Christian and how you can use that as a testimony. And so sometimes we don't understand why we experience anxiety, why it becomes such a problem in our life. But a lot of times God can use that to help us to relate to other people. When I'm working with someone with anxiety, I always let them know, I experience this. I know how difficult. Not in a sense that I'm making the session about me, but just letting them know that this is a normal experience that a lot of people have, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just something that you need to take and control so that you can live the life that God's called you to live. And a lot of times anxiety is a part of that.
Can I add one quick thing? Another thing that I try to encourage people is that normalcy is that we're all broken people. And yes, we're created all individually, but then we're also created and brought into this broken world. And so a part of it, I think, is just our sinful nature that some of us have to fight differently through this life. We are born again. We are going through this process, but it's a transition. You know, we're not just born again Christians who are automatically all of the things that existed in us are now gone, you know, and so going from maybe being, you know, not saved to saved doesn't automatically mean anxiety or things like that are going to be gone. So I think a big part of it is to recognize we're broken individuals who are steadily in a process of transition, you know, that salvation is working in us. But unless there is miraculous healing in our bodies, or until we are, you know, taken into heaven, then we're always going to have some of those things. So being okay with saying this is a process and it is normal because of where we are in this world. I think that's a big part of it. And then I thought about a question that you had sent us is that I think some of those scriptures, they should be goals. Because it's not that we ever reach that place where we are 100% not anxious, praying about everything, right? It is a goal to continuously work toward. But the day that or when you have a bad day and you're like, I really didn't pray about this and I did worry about it all day, okay, do better the next day. It's a goal to reach toward, not to say it's an actualization that I have conquered this where I have no anxiety and I pray about everything. Well, I want to be friends with you and study you because you're pretty amazing. So those two things is the only thing I would add. Those are goals to work toward, I believe, and recognizing that we are still in this world.
Kind of like go ahead, please go.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to it. You know, like you said, it's a process. And one of the Bible verses that I use most is in Philippians, take every thought captive. That is an active process. That's not a one-time, I took my thoughts captive, and so I never have anxiety again. So that's an active process, and there's an example after example in the Bible. Even Jesus Christ and his fulfillment on the cross and resurrection, that was a process. That didn't just happen because something was spoken and in an instant everything changed. So it's the same thing working through anxiety or any issue. You know, it's something that we have to continuously work on.
So one of the things that my mom used to tell me when I was growing up was she was very avid, like 21 days.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you got to break a habit. It's going to take 21 days. Mm-hmm. Is there, like, how do you balance that? I know one of the resources that you had sent me, Dr. Leaf was kind of talking about 21 days versus 63 days, and maybe like some things take longer. What is the science for somebody who's trying to process, maybe even going through balancing anxiety or an addiction or just a different side of maybe mental illness or whatnot? Like, how do they set a goal maybe of something to help them move past something or move to help aid them into getting over that or walking through it?
Okay. So anytime we want to make a change in our life, we actually have to go through a process of rewiring our brain. And that's where like they say, 21 days to create a habit, but when you're actually rewiring your brain and choosing to give up an addictive behavior or take control of your anxiety, anytime we're trying to do something like that, it takes time. And so it's literally like if you were going through the woods and you had this path that you always took, it's the easiest one to go, but you wanted to create a new path, well, that would take time. You would have to take your axe or whatever and go out and clear the path, and over time, that path would develop and the other one would grow over, and that's kind of the way our brain works. And so, it's just a process. So you have to know where you want to go, what your goals are, and then you just begin the work. And oftentimes, people give up early in the process because they initially start going to counseling and they get all this information and they're able to talk about their problems. and they feel so much better and hopeful, and then they realize, oh, this is hard. I actually have to start thinking about what I'm thinking about. I have to go through these exercises. I have to change the way I look at life. And so a lot of people become disillusioned with it, and they give up before they reach that point of rewiring their brain.
So how do you tell somebody who's maybe been struggling with maybe some sort of mental illness for a really long time, and they're thinking about giving up, or they're thinking about like, this isn't working anymore, what's the point? You know, I've done counseling, I've done medicine. Where do they lie in this spectrum? I've tried Jesus, like nothing is working for me. Is there a next step for them, like as far as just help, or what does that look like?
That's a deep one. I guess my initial curiosity is, what has been done and how, kind of like what Cassandra said, is how much did they stick to it? Any kind of thoughts that feel hopeless, or any thoughts about ourselves where we feel worthless, where, we don't want to exist anymore. We want to give up. We don't want to continue on in this life, or, maybe this world would be better if I wasn't in it anymore. It would be easier for other people. Any of these type of thoughts or statements that we say to ourselves, my initial thought is, what's underneath that? Okay, because most people who have those thoughts, it's less that they actually want to die and not exist. It's more that they don't want to exist the way they currently are. They don't want to exist currently in the life that they're experiencing, or they want the pain to end. And so that's my question is, what is the pain that feels overwhelming, that feels like you can't carry that burden anymore? What is it about your current situation that feels like I can't keep going through this every single day? That's where I would start is, okay, what is it that you wish was different? And then start addressing the core need of that. And maybe in counseling, it never got to that. Maybe the medication just tried to mask it. Because I believe that ultimately those types of thoughts are symptoms of something underneath. And the underneath is what we need to address, not the thoughts.
Yeah. So that would be what I've heard is like the root, right? Is that so? Before we can even address anything, it's getting to the root. And that's almost with anything like, and not even anxiety related, just maybe it's a parent relationship, maybe it's maybe not understanding why you're not learning anything in school. Like, we got to get to the root issue of this all.
Right. It's what's underneath, and sometimes it's trauma, sometimes it's struggles, sometimes it's, for example, social learning disabilities. If you're struggling in school, maybe something just has never been diagnosed that makes it harder for you, right? And to be honest, oftentimes that's going to require counseling. Because if somebody's been dealing with this for a while and they haven't figured it out on their own, that's where professionals can come in, and we can help be that objective person to start poking those holes and saying, okay, what about this? What about this? And not to dig in, not to just ask, okay, tell me your life from A to Z, but to help people figure out what that core need is and then address the problem itself.
Another thing that we often see, and this one's a little trickier to kind of help someone understand, is that anxiety or whatever they're going through has become such an identity for them that apart from that, they don't know who they are. And so, like you said, it requires digging deeper and going, okay, let's look at some of the reasons why maybe you're hitting roadblocks. What's underneath there that's keeping you stuck in this spot. And so that can be a little bit more difficult to work through, but something that has to be done before you can move forward.
So in just a couple more minutes, and this might go to the left, so feel free to just axe it. Can anxiety turn into depression? Can anxiety lead to something more? Or is it just like anxiety is just its own thing on the left, and then that's just all it is? Can it lead into something else? And if that's a whole different conversation, then we can do that a different time.
Yeah, so anxiety and depression very often work together. You can have anxiety without depression. You can have depression without anxiety. But if you think about the anxious mind and all the thoughts that are going through it, It's like a hamster wheel, just constantly going. And a lot of time, those messages that we're replaying in our mind are very negative. And so when you consider, first of all, that's exhausting to have your mind always going. But second of all, we're feeding ourselves with negative thoughts. And that's depressing. If I followed you around all day and told you some of the things that might be going through my mind, you would probably feel pretty bad after a while, right? And so that's what typically happens. It starts spiraling into depression because you feel hopeless, you feel really bad about yourself, and then you start to withdraw from people and you become depressed. The more depressed you become, the more anxious you feel and the more hopeless, and it just continues this whole cycle that very often happens when you're dealing with anxiety.
I'd like to add one thing, and it's kind of on the before side, is we're talking a lot about, noticing anxiety symptoms and how it can progress and get worse. But I think it's also important to look at, okay, maybe what are some signals to maybe risk factors on how it may be developing. So kind of catching it before it gets worse. And the biggest thing that I personally harp on and help people think about is like, how did it get there? And one thing is that we feel overwhelmed. Like maybe it's stress about work, school, family. Maybe it's trauma that we've experienced, abuse that we've experienced. So if these are any things that you've experienced in your life and you're like, wow, this feels hard. Sometimes I feel really overwhelmed. Sometimes it's really hard to get out of bed. Sometimes it's really hard to turn my brain off at night and it's hard to go to sleep. But you may not feel like life is truly bad, right? But it's just sometimes it happens. So I just want to put that out there, like noticing patterns, noticing when those things seem to happen fairly often, and then just realizing, okay, maybe I need to make a change in this area, or I need to pay attention to it before it gets worse.
So, in the last question of this, and we can kind of make it quick, and I'll get to some of their questions. At what point does it get to the spot where you need, like, you try to do it yourself, you need to go see a counselor, or you need to take medicine, or you need to see a therapist? Like, is there a threshold of, this is bigger than, Darian sitting in this room and crying, or this is bigger than Darian can't go to sleep at night? Like, when do I see you guys, and when do I take medicine, and when do I pick up the phone and call somebody?
So you can see us at any point. Even if you're just going through a normal period of what we would consider typical anxiety everyone has, sometimes we can help you through that. But definitely, if you find that this is becoming a pattern and you're withdrawing from relationships, you're really struggling at work, it's interfering with life, that's a clear sign that you need to go talk to someone and get some help to deal with that.
All right, so a lot of you guys submitted questions into your small group leaders, and so I kind of compiled maybe about 6 or 9 of them that I thought were really good, and I think maybe would apply to a lot of people inside the room. So I'm going to ask them, and then if you guys want to popcorn or whatever, we can kind of go from there. We've got a little bit of time, so I'll probably just do maybe half of them. But this first one I think is a good one to say. How does situational anxiety and anxiety attacks work for non-anxious person?
Well, typically, like, it's how does it happen?
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the thing with panic or anxiety attacks, is oftentimes they do feel like they come out of nowhere. So truth is, someone who thinks they're not anxious and then all of a sudden they're experiencing some significant symptoms, there probably is something there that they haven't been aware of, and it's coming out in relation to some stimulant in their environment. So if it feels it's coming out of nowhere, I would definitely pay attention to it. But if anything, just starting to notice what we said is patterns. So if it happens once and you never have another panic attack, it could have just been that you were having a really bad day and it just all felt overwhelming, right? And it never happens again. It's not really something that needs attention right then. So that's, I guess, my immediate response. If it's not something that's normally happening, it happens once, Okay, just kind of note it in the back of your mind. If you're unsure, there are apps on phones to track your mood. Mood trackers, mood diaries. And so if you're unsure of what your patterns are, get one of those apps and just log it.
That's good. Another question for you guys. Is anxiety a part of you not trusting God enough to provide or to be present in certain situations? That might be a heavy one, but.
Part of not trusting God. It can be. I mean, if you're trying to live in your own strength and you're constantly worrying about things, yeah, there is an element of not trusting God. But like we mentioned earlier, if you grow up in a home where that's the coping mechanism, you know, mom or dad is always anxious, always worrying about things, and that's just what you've learned, then you're typically going to do that just out of habit. So it's not necessarily about actively saying, I don't care what God has to say. You know, a lot of times there is a real clinical issue underneath. But once you begin to calm those things down, you should ultimately turn to God and learn to rely on Him.
Speaking of coping mechanisms, this one is, I think, a good follow-up to it. It says, my main coping mechanism is to suppress the problem and cut off and shut down, cut off any feelings towards it, thus usually resulting in never addressing the problem. Any advice or tips on how to not do that and process in a healthy way?
We learn how to cope in the moment. You know, we learn from people around us. We learn based on our understanding at that time. So what I always tell clients is we don't necessarily need to judge how we have coped in the past. It's just at some point when we recognize this isn't working for me anymore, or I don't like how I'm coping with this. Now that you're aware, it's important to do something about it. So my first my first response might be just now that when we avoid feelings and thoughts and emotions, it's usually because it feels really hard, really heavy, really scary. And it's like, I just don't know how I'm going to be able to cope with this. How am I going to be able to deal with this? It's just too much. So we push it away. What happens is we avoid, and that tank of avoidance gets bigger. And then we definitely want to seal that off because there's so much in there. If we take off the lid, it feels really scary. So the truth is, if that's been going on for a long time, I would more than likely suggest counseling or some professional person who can help you kind of gently take off the lid, or at least empower you to be able to sit with them. Because ultimately, you're going to need to sit with the emotions. You're going to need to feel them and experience them. And if it feels too scary to do on your own, that's why we're here.
So, this is not a question on here, but this is a question I just had. My mom is like old school, right? Like if I were to tell her like, hey mom, I'm going to go see a counselor, she would think that I'm crazy. And she's opened up more to it. But what do you say to like a mom or a dad who is like Bible, like pray, put the oil on the head, like the old school. And like for a lot of people in here, like I think counseling is normal. I encourage it, but a lot of our parents don't necessarily think that way. Why? Like where's the divide inside the church, or even just like in the generations that we can maybe normalize that?
For some reason, there's been a stigma around mental health, and for some reason, we separate mental health from physical health. So if you were a runner and you hurt your ankle, your mom probably wouldn't say, pull out your Bible and read Bible verses and pray over it, right? You would want to go get help for that. So it's the same thing with our mental health. Unfortunately, people don't always see it that way. So sometimes explaining, there is a brain chemistry that's involved. And so a lot of times, this is happening in my brain. I really don't have control over it. And so I need to get on medication to kind of calm those nerves and to be able to help me focus more. So just helping people understand it's a normal problem. Our brain is a part of our body, just like our ankle. So
just one quick thing on that is, a counselor or a professional is an objective person that doesn't have a stake in your life. Like, I care about you, but I don't have an opinion on what you do in your life. And so that's another way, is that, sometimes it's just a safe place to talk about any and everything that you need to, and not worrying about your mom or your friend you got to see at dinner tomorrow night.
Yeah, I think sometimes parents get a little bit frightened because, you always see on TV, you go to a psychotherapist, you lay on the couch, and they say, tell me about your mom and dad. So I think parents get a little bit frightened by that.
Yeah. Disclaimer, because my mom is probably going to watch this. She is an advocate for counseling. Just want to throw that out there because I love you, Mom. Okay, so here's another one. This question just surrounds depressive phases, one of which when you don't want to exist anymore. Any advice or thoughts on how to fight these phases?
Well, I think we kind of referenced that earlier, is if you're going through phases where you're having some of these thoughts, is what have you done to deal with it, and then getting to the core issue of it. Because if you're going through phases and you never attended counseling or saw a psychiatrist for medication, then, that's a place to start, is to try to figure out, what is this phase, what is this pattern going on?
Yeah, and just like there are different types of anxiety, there are different types of depression, or different causes for depression. And so a lot of times you do need to see someone to try to figure out what's causing yours. Yeah.
I love that. Maybe two more questions. This one I think will be, hopefully helps a lot of people. What are some helpful things to say to someone who has shared with you that they're struggling with depression and anxiety? For example, some people will try to downplay it and say, I get stressed too sometimes, which can be obviously insensitive or not even helpful. Is there a sentence or a phrase that maybe can help somebody cope, or maybe somebody can help them express how they're feeling and helping them kind of help aid them?
I don't know about a sentence or a phrase, but listen. I mean, there is so much power in being able to have someone just listen to your story, listen to what you're going through. And so being that kind of friend, small group leader, that just says, let's talk about it. I want to hear your story. There's a lot of healing that comes from just that.
And that's the key, is listen without judgment, listen without giving those cliche statements like, well, here's a Bible verse, let's throw it at it. Like, let them get their story out first, stay present. Yeah.
And then last question, and we'll kind of just wrap from here. But how much of anxiety comes from just like genuinely wanting to be in control? Like, do people who having, like, is it, I just got to be in control. I know what I want. I'm going to do it. And then that creates anxiety. Is that a cycle, or is that a brain mechanism?
My simple answer is what we said earlier, is what's the core problem. Because typically, if we want control over something, there's a reason. When we are trying to exercise so much control, say, over our schedule, we want control over something because there's other things in our lives we don't have control over. And so maybe in our childhood, we didn't have control over, where we lived. We moved around so much. So then we become hyper-focused on something we can control, like our career, and it has to be a certain way. And so when we find ourselves being more, focused on trying to control something, a question to ask is, what is out of my control? What is it that I'm trying to overcompensate because there's something else that has either happened in my life in the past or currently? I get so focused on cleaning my house because my relationships are out of control. So as far as the control piece, simply is what feels out of control, or what have you not been able to control in your life? And absolutely control when things get out of our control and it starts messing with the things we've gotten hyper-focused on, it can definitely lead to anxiety.
Yeah. So good. I think one of the things I just wanted to share with you guys, for a lot of people in the room, like, you guys struggle with anxiety. And sometimes it's super heavy, and sometimes you don't necessarily know how to deal with it or how to cope with it. Obviously, we're here, or not necessarily me, I'm here to talk through. I'm not a professional, but I'm here as a pastor, as a friend, to be able to sit down with you guys and have these conversations. But I just want to champion you guys, because you are professionals. You've gone to school, the science, the Bible. And so getting a chance to put those two worlds together is something that does not go lightly. And so I just want to encourage, if you guys have any opportunities on your schedule. Maybe it's just an hour. Do you guys do 30-minute or just hour sessions? Hour sessions. Just an hour. Please sit down with them. You can call the church. You guys can schedule an appointment. I think you guys can even go online, maybe even do that. And so please, don't feel weird about it. Don't feel like this is maybe something that is cliche or it's not necessarily working. We believe in small groups at Praise Church, and actually Ms. Cassandra and Kayla have gotten a chance to teach our small group leaders and our upcoming small group leaders as well, and have walked through just what it looks like, a very brief overview of how to handle anxiety, how to handle depression when these conversations come up inside your small groups, how to deal with anxiety, how to talk about abuse. What does that look like when somebody talks about sexual abuse or trauma? So I want you guys to believe in your small group leaders as well, and you don't always have to maybe necessarily run to a counselor. Your small group leaders want to listen to you guys. Your church wants to listen to you guys, but we do believe in counseling, and we believe in prayer, and we're going to have an opportunity at the end of this tonight where our small group leaders and our prayer team is going to come down the front. And so maybe you're struggling with anxiety, or maybe you're struggling with depression, or maybe you're struggling with some sort of trauma or a root issue, and you want to have this, you want to keep this conversation going. I'm going to encourage you guys, please don't just go home on a regular Tuesday night. Pray with somebody and get somebody to come into your life. Just as they said, somebody who can sit down from you and have a one-on-one conversation, our prayer team, our small group leaders, our church staff wants to be in your life. We want to be a part of your situation. And so don't shy away from that. I think a lot of times there's a lot of shame and condemnation of talking about an issue or a trauma or a root thing. There is no shame. Right? And if there's any place not to have, it should be the church, it should be Praise Church, it should be PYA. And so maybe there's a past thing that you're so embarrassed to talk about because it's gonna make you sound crazy. Maybe you are, I don't know, you've got something that sounds quote unquote like bipolar, or you've got, depression, or you've got something that people are like, oh my gosh. Don't feel shame in that, please. Please, please, please do not. I know they're obviously equipped to do that, but I believe in our prayer team. I believe in our small group leaders, and I just want to champion small groups as well. And so I believe in small groups. Praise Church believes in them. PYA does. And so maybe you're saying, I don't know what my next step is. I would say your next step is to get into a small group. Begin that conversation with a group of people who are the same life stage as you, maybe they're in the same type of relationship as you, and just open those doors up with a guy to guy and a girl to girl conversation, because I really do believe in that, and I really do. Is there anything, if you guys just have one more statement that you would want to say just to encourage the 18, 25-year-olds as far as, being anxious or being depressed or anything like that? I know this is a big conversation that we fit into an hour, so.
Yeah, you brought up shame. That's something we could spend a whole hour on, but just realize shame grows in darkness, and when you expose it to the light, which means connection to other people, and you become vulnerable and open up, that's when that shame starts to fade away.
I just want to add, as far as the counseling piece, is that it's not going to hurt anything. Even if you're a little leery, you're unsure, maybe you've heard some horror stories, or you've seen movies and it's like, oh yeah, they have to lie on the couch or something. Just give it a chance. 1 hour of your life is just to see if it's something that you really need. It's not gonna hurt you. I can tell you from my experience, and I believe the same for Cassandra too, is that we are not gonna force you to give us your whole trauma history. We are gonna meet you where you are, talk about what you need to talk about. So if you're even considering it, just give it one time, see what it's like, and then make your decision. And then the other part of that is it's all about the right fit for you and your counselor. So maybe you've been to a counselor before, it's a bad experience. Don't give up on counseling just because that person wasn't a good fit for you.
That's so good. So Ms. Cassandra and Ms. Kayla have put together a list of resources, some books, some podcasts, some YouTube videos, articles even, and just Right Now Media stuff, YouVersion activities, and if inside the lobby, there's a full printout of it, and it's also going to be on our social media that we'd love for you guys to. Yeah, some of the stuff is up there. The detoxing video is incredible. I've watched 2 of the Right Now Medias. They're very good. The YouVersion plan is incredible. And like I said, I'm going to share with your small group leaders so you guys can have all those resources. But there's also about 30 printout pieces of paper at the lobby where you would sign up for. And I want you guys to pick those up, take them home, and like I said, we'll share them on social media. Ms. Cassandra, will you pray for us?
Father, I just thank you for this time tonight that we've had to meet together as a body of believers, Lord. And I just thank you for each of these young adults and their passion to serve you and to grow and their willingness to be here. And I just pray for each one of them as they work through their lives and the various things that they're struggling with. I just pray that you will be with them, that they will look to you as their ultimate hope and their source of help. And I just pray that you will just lead them in their futures, Lord, and that if they are experiencing difficult situations, that they would reach out to someone and they would get help. In your name.